Ladies and gentlemen, now the time is 2:30 in Korea, so we are ready to start the session 2 of the seminar. The theme of the session 2 is Arctic shipping route operations, and as we did in the session 1, Professor Yoon from KMOU will serve as the moderator. Please welcome again Professor Yoon with a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. The second session is about Arctic shipping route operations. And in the second session, like the first session, we're going to invite 3 presenters. And our first presenter is Professor Arild Moe from Fridtjof Nansen Institute. And his presentation will be on Russian plans and policies for the NSR in a new international environment. And he's joining us online. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be able to give a presentation at this important conference. Obviously, very much has changed in the course of the last year, and the outlook for the Northern Sea route is very different today than it was just 11 months ago. What I will do is present the official Russian plans, statements about the NSR and the current situation, and discuss them in light of the new international situation. Next slide, please. As we all know, the Northern Sea route has enjoyed very high priority in Russia for quite some time. And there are good reasons for that. It is because of its domestic functions. It is an internal waterway between east and west of Russia, and it is essential to supply settlements along the coast. That has not changed. It is also a channel for development of resources, of which there are quite plentiful in the northern part of Russia and northern Siberia. But also the sea route in itself, and especially the icebreaker fleet, has its own purpose. It is a way of securing mobility all over the Arctic. And this is in Russia seen as an important security element. Finally, the Northern Sea route seemed to offer the potential for transit traffic that could bring in revenues from outside. This has already been mentioned and is well known for all the participants in this seminar, but optimism regarding international transits was very strong some 10, 12 years ago. It has subsided considerably. Next slide, please. So, what is the Russian view, or the official view, on the Arctic in general and the Northern Sea route in particular, given the crisis in Russia and in international relations unleashed by the Russian invasion into Ukraine? This quotation from Vladimir Putin this spring is fairly representative. It shows that they are not really saying anything about the crisis as a restraining force, rather the opposite. The official Russian argument is because of the problems Russia is facing due to sanctions and reduction in trade with the West, the sea route becomes even more important, and consequently development plans for the sea route should be enhanced, they should be maximized rather than cut back. So this is the official view. Next slide, please. In August this year, a new revised plan for the NSR was published in Russia. Many of the elements are known from before, but again, it is stating that the goal of Russian policies for the NSR is to secure reliable and safe transportation of cargo and products for people living in the extreme north, as I mentioned earlier, and also establish conditions for realization of investment projects. Yes, that is quite obvious goals. As you see, transit is not really highlighted as a primary goal here. But the plan then contains a list of investment projects, and they are quite extensive, and they include both further LNG developments. It includes oil, very big oil projects, the Vostok oil project headed by Rosneft, and it also contains a coal project. Moreover, there is also a plan for development of a large copper project further east at Chukotka. And we have also the plans for transshipment terminals for LNG in Murmansk as well as Kamchatka, which were made some years ago and are seen as a way of optimizing and economizing the transportation of LNG. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There are also plans for further developments of the icebreaker fleet, including this super strong leader icebreaker, but not only nuclear icebreakers, also non-nuclear LNG-powered icebreakers. There is a clear statement about development of Arctic shipyards, more rescue vessels, back please, back, and enormous investments. Well, there's no need, I think, to discuss all these items in detail, because the overarching question is, are these plans feasible? Are they, is it possible to find finance for these plans? They assume a combination of state budget finance and non-budget finance, that is from users and investors of the sea routes. I think this, the question about economic realism is very relevant, and what I miss in the Russian plans, which I always miss in Russian plans, is a clear list of priorities. What is most important? What should be prioritized if not everything can be accomplished? That is not easy to read out of the plan. Next slide, please. So what are the assumptions underlying these very extensive plans for the Northern Sea routes? Well, the Russian plan for the NSR operates with what they call a base scenario. That is the plans for production submitted by the various cargo owners, basically the extraction project owners in the Arctic. Putting them together is then giving an impression of what is of the amount of cargo that will be transported on the Northern Sea route. I'll give some detail a little bit later. But there is also a risk scenario that was developed by Rosatom, which is less ambitious and is trying to include the complexity of realization of Arctic projects. and the delays that are evident. In fact, this risk scenario was made before the war, so it's not taking into account the new situation. But what is interesting is that Rosatom, which is now responsible for the management and development of NSR, has tried to reduce the expectations. And that has been a very difficult task, it seems. And the official goals for the Northern Sea route have been maintained, even if they clearly have been unrealistic for some time. But Rosatom, of course, knows that they will be kept responsible for developments. And therefore, they're trying to present more realistic assumptions. But again, both these scenarios, both the base scenario and the risk scenario, was made before the war. But they had not been changed. The base scenario has not been changed. You may say it's because there's too little time to do it, but I think it's clearly a problem that discussions and plans for the NSR continue to be presented as if nothing had changed. Please, next slide. And this is, in fact, how this base scenario is built up. We see a very, very steep increase in the 2020s. Very much of this is made up of the orange column, which is oil, which is the Vostok oil project headed by Rosneft. An extremely ambitious project, which would bring production up to 100 million tons of oil at the end of this decade, which would be the biggest development in the Russian oil industry since the 1970s. And it is highly uncertain proposition because of the investment needs and the costs. And some would also say that there is a problem with the resource base. No international oil company was interested in joining this project before the war. They were all invited, but they all declined. So as of now, the project is still ongoing, but I think it's very unrealistic that it could reach anything like these proportions. It's also here assumed that the development of LNG projects will continue. But as we already have heard, there is a big uncertainty about further developments beyond the first train of the Arctic LNG 2 project. So we have Yamal LNG continuing on plateau level and maybe some increase, but not the kind of increase that was envisaged before the war. And the reason here is mainly the technology sanctions, which is hampering development. This could, of course, change in some years, but at least for the nearest future, it's clear that LNG development will be delayed. And there are also question marks about some of the other items here. So the message is that the underlying assumptions for the cargo scenario is unrealistic. Next slide, please. On the icebreaker side, much has been happening, and the ambitions are high, but also in fact, the ongoing construction activity is also quite extensive. This slide shows the whole story about Russian nuclear icebreakers from the very start. You don't have to pay attention to that, but on the right side here, you see what is happening now, if the colors are clear. There have been new icebreakers coming on stream last few years, and there are new icebreakers under construction. So it's reason to believe that within the next few years, the Russian icebreaker fleet will be renewed and will be very much stronger than it was just a few years ago. The construction of the super leader icebreaker has started. Of course, it may stop if financing becomes difficult, but it is also possible that it will be completed. In fact, there are ideas of not firm plans, but quite strong statements about building even 2 more leader icebreakers. They are not included in the new NSR plan, but they are talked about as a possibility into the 2030s. But the message here is that, yes, the Russian icebreaker fleet will be renewed. It will be stronger than ever in a few years' time. So what is it going to do if the cargo scenario is severely reduced? That is an interesting question. But capacities may be, icebreaking capacity may be quite different from what it used to be a few years ago. Next slide, please. Yeah, here is the newest Artera class icebreaker between 2 other older class icebreakers. Next slide, please. A key, to the extent that the changes in the world are being incorporated in Russian thinking, it is clearly the hope that Asian markets will take over some of the exports that used to go westwards. So developing the Northern Sea route is relevant in that connection because seaborne transport to Asia seems to be an alternative for some of the exports that has been going to the West. And that is also the official view. Now, first of all, let us say that when it comes to LNG, so far this year, the overwhelming share of the Russian LNG is going to Europe. And that is because the prices of gas in Europe has been very, very high. So from a commercial point of view, this has been the right decision. And it should be stressed that so far there has been no limitations on the Russian LNG sales. There are sanctions affecting LNG development, new LNG projects, but no limitation of LNG sales. And it's unclear how this will develop in the years ahead. Will there be some limitations? Or will LNG sales from Russia be regarded as something different from pipeline gas? That will be an important issue since LNG is such a big share of NSR shipping. When it comes to other products and minerals and metals and anything, in fact, being produced and possibly exported from Russia, it's true that there are some capacity limitations in the railway transport system, which also is an argument for using NSR. But of course, NSR doesn't fit with all kinds of export destinations. So this has to be looked into in more detail. But the expectation and official rhetoric is very much about the possibility of Asian markets. Next slide, please. What has been going on for some time now is a change in the policies for management of the NSR. This an important decision was made in 2018 by making Rosatom, the state nuclear energy corporation, the so-called unified logistics operator of the NSR. And that is basically giving Rosatom total responsibility for development and current operations. There was a long conflict or dispute with the Ministry of Transport about sharing roles in the management of the NSR. But by this summer, I think we could say that this struggle was finally resolved in favor of Rosatom. Since this summer, Rosatom has taken over also issuing of permits to sail on the NSR. So the Northern Sea Route Administration has very little functions left. And firmer slide, please. Keep the firmer slide. Also, in fact, Rosatom created a new division called the Main Administration of the Northern Sea Route, the Glavsevmorput. It is, in fact, the name that was used for the administration of the NSR in the 1930s, and which was an all-encompassing body taking care of all kinds of development of the sea route and adjoining industrial activities. So this is clearly a sign that we are going back in time in a very sort of broad, all-encompassing administration of the NSR. This latest development was not caused by the war and the specific challenges caused by the war, but it is it conforms with general development in the Russian economy, where the state control is increasing in all spheres of the economy. The immediate argument and reason for the latest round of reform, next slide please, was what happened in last November, and which has already been mentioned. There clearly was a problem in coordinating traffic on the NSR and icebreaker support, which led to all these cargo ships being frozen, which was sort of a very big problem and gave a sort of a negative image of the NSR. Actually, this was also a blame game. Was it because the icebreaker fleet hadn't been operative enough, or was it because the Northern Sea Route Administration hadn't been looking clearly into the implication of issuing permits? Well, we don't really know. But at least at the end of the day, this was used as an argument of collecting all responsibilities within the Rosatom structure. Please, next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. This new model, this centralized model, it can't be questioned how well it will work. It's supposed to give better coordination and higher efficiency. But monopolization also could be a big problem, and less transparency in the management of the NSR, seen from the outside. It's also, I think, a problem that Rosatom is also involved in commercial operations. It wants to be involved in shipping activities, which would be in competition with other users. And finally, will it be able to deliver? It is expected to secure development of this NSR, not only in management terms, but also in cargo volume. And this may, as I already said, be a big problem. But not only because of the operations of Rosatom, but because of objective situation in the markets. Last slide, please. Next. So many uncertainties, and I think that goes for many of the presentations today. Yes, things are changing, and we are seeing many negative developments. We don't know exactly how much they will mean. I think the question about state finances is essential. How much will the state be able to subsidize Arctic infrastructure? Very unclear, depends on the whole state of the Russian economy. But also the outside view. What about investors? And I think that was very well presented in the former presentation. The risk assessment of other investors. What is Russia going to do with NSR? Will it change the rules of the game and the conditions for the use, which is, of course, very negative from a long-term investment point of view. But also, what about sanctions? Will the crisis sort of remain? Could there be new sanctions directly affecting shipping? We don't know. The role of China is, I think, going to be bigger. How big is not clear. China has the possibility to support with some technologies that are no sanctioned, but not everything and not in the short perspective. China has an interest in hydrocarbons and other raw materials from the Arctic, but it's not dependent on them. And I think Chinese investors and Chinese companies will always be demanding good conditions for investments. And they know that Russia is in a difficult position and will take advantage of that when they negotiate terms. We haven't touched on that today, but I think if you look at the Arctic in the general longer perspective, with the changes taking place in the climate world, climate policies, changes in the international markets, especially for energy, could also affect the Arctic projects, especially because of the relatively high production costs, which could mean that in the longer perspective, resources, expensive resources, energy resource from market could become less interesting. But that is a longer term perspective. As a final note, I would say that yes, very much now depends on internal political and economic developments in Russia. That is quite clear, and that is very uncertain. But one must always remember the broader international market, global market developments, as a decisive, a very important factor in determining the volume of cargo on the NSR. Thank you for your attention.
예,
Thank you for your presentation. And Professor Moe talked about the changes in the circumstances. And he talked about the project that entails that will require about $30 billion of investment, and he looked at the factors to determine whether this project will be feasible with the concrete examples. And the official perspective, should it be revised after the war? And will there be any impact on the LNG shipbuilding? And the state control has been strengthened with the war, and it is also connected to the stronger control of Rosatom. And he also mentioned the accident of the vessels last year. And in conclusion, he also mentioned the financial sanctions and the war is kind of strengthening enlarging the role of China. And thank you for your presentation.
발표는
Let us move on to the second presentation. The speaker is Dr. Kim Hyun-chul. He is Principal Director at the Center of RS and GIS, Korea Polar Research Institute, under the topic of status of Arctic sea ice and its impact on navigation in the Arctic shipping route. Please welcome him with a round of applause.
예,
Hello everyone, once again my name is Kim Hyun-chul. I'm from KOPRI, Center for RS and GIS. I believe maybe I have prepared something that you are not familiar with. I will today talk about how the sea ice changes in the Arctic region based on the data we collected using satellites. So the homework given to me is that to share with you, it's a really big picture. How the sea ice changes in the Arctic and what kind of impacts that they are bringing. So we are faced with realistic, challenges. Maybe you already know, maybe more than me, but from a scientific perspective, I'd like to share with you the very, latest information with you. Maybe you're not familiar with, maybe you're not very much, interested, but I hope this is quite interesting to you. So, as already I mentioned, this is about measuring the ice thickness in the Arctic region. So, yes, previous speakers talked about the logistics and shipping, but I believe that the most important thing is, maybe most important factor is the condition of the sea ice in that region. So, that significantly impacts whether we can fully tap into the potential of the Northern Sea route or the Arctic Ocean in general. Navigations will be available throughout the year, or just for the selected seasons. So some climate researchers say that in the next 20 or the 30 years we will no longer have any ice left in the Arctic region, or IPCC report says before we reach 2050 that will happen. So but there are some who say that some say by 2030, some say by 2050, but the key point here is that anyhow, ice melting is happening way too faster than we would like to have. So at the moment, in that regard, we believe it's really important for us to have really accurate data on the ice thickness and ice condition in general in the Arctic region. This will certainly serve as a really good foundation for us to come up with, right policies and regulations. So in our center, researchers and staff there, we have dedicated great efforts to that end. So yes, there are already a lot of available data on the sea ice, but about thickness, that's we are focusing on. The map on the left shows the Arctic mean field of sea ice thickness and drift. So from Siberia and those regions close to Norway and Greenland and Canada, they have a kind of a multi-year, relatively thick ice, and on the contrary, in the Siberian area, maybe that's because there are different currents flowing. So again, those ice, drifting along with the currents. So based on these data, how are we going to better utilize the Arctic sea routes or the Northern sea routes? So obviously many want to have year-round operation in this area. So to that end, to support that potential to realize, we have conducted research activities. So on the right, that shows for the last 40 years the thickness almost decreased by half. So and those data are collected by submarines. So maybe this is not really good quality, but this is maybe the best data in consideration of the period of the data collection. So again, long story short, the thickness is decreasing. But what's irony is that if you look at the the left graph, any data so far does not give. There's no data which give us the accurate data on the sea ice in summer season. I'm talking about not just all the seasons, but summer season. So yes, everyone knows that sea ice in the Arctic region is melting, and we have satellites which can detect and collect the changing conditions of the sea ice. Yes, in the summer season, maybe relatively speaking, sea ice volume and mass aren't much less than they can be recorded in other seasons, but still in summer seasons it's also important for us, and it's valuable for us to have a really accurate data on the sea ice conditions in the Arctic region. So to that end, we are making preparations to further collect and analyze more accurate data on that. And on the right, there are two different graphs that show that this continuous Arctic sea ice volume trend, again, they do not provide data on summer seasons. So yes, we can estimate the maximum and minimum thickness of the sea ice in the region, but still we do not have the summer season data. That means at the end of the day, whatever simulation algorithm we use, that will not generate accurate results. So some may have a really simplified approach, but I mean, actually, to be honest with you, some of our researchers, including myself, have that kind of thought as well. Well, maybe it's simpler than we anticipated, but as we conducted the research project, actually the outcome was quite surprising to us, and that's what I'd like to share with you. So, the basic idea or concept we applied for that research project is that, I mean, based on the thickness of the ice, I mean, yes, there are, I mean, ice we can analyze or, I mean, yeah, analyze above the surface. But, I mean, more than 90% of the sea ice are actually ice dropped, meaning below the sea surface. So what we used is that, I mean, we measured the drift below the, I mean, the water surface. That means we tried to narrow the, I mean, the error. And there's another, I mean, measuring machine called the upward looking sonar. So we installed several of them and collected data for several years. So we compared, I mean, the drift measured several years ago and the recent ones. So combined, we analyzed, I mean, what are the relations and what happened in that period. So if you look at the, I mean, the picture, I mean, this shows where the upward-looking sonar, called the ULS in short, where they are located, and as shown on the, I mean, figure on the right. So this is the schematic of the mooring. So as you can see, sea ice is just, I mean, flowing on the surface and below the surface. So we measure the thickness in the summer season. So yes, the sea ice melts, I mean, above the surface. So that actually is not accurately detected by the satellites, but below the sea level, we can actually measure more accurately. So those are the graphs, so the draft changes. As you can see at the bottom, based on the satellite data, we analyze the signals. Those, I mean, the red dots vertically, those lines show that, I mean, drift dramatically changes. This is the kind of a signal that tells us that this is the point that we approach the summer season. But what's more important for us is that, I mean, we should have a really accurate understanding of the, I mean, sea ice thickness change in the winter season. So we completed a project last October, and based on the, I mean, the result, we now took upon another follow-up research activity. So again, there's another, I mean, measuring machine called AMSAR, advanced, I mean, measuring machine. So regardless of it's just summer or winter season, so these, I mean, measuring instruments ensured us to have accurate data on the thickness of sea ice in the Arctic region. Then those data will be translated into anticipating what will happen, and also that will support the navigational, I mean, arrangements in the Arctic region. So this slide shows the determination of the estimation equation formula. So we measured, as you can see, I mean, from 0.0, I mean, for each band, we, yeah, correlated and adjusted. As you can see, there are equation and formula applied for that analysis. So as long as we have, I mean, accurate definition for for denominator, those will accurately reflect the thickness and ice conditions. So anyhow, as you can see, I mean, with the ULS collected data, I mean, we have numerous comparisons. So drift, I mean, thickness, meaning that below the water surface line, the thickness of those black dots are ULS data. I mean, maybe all these are accurate 100%, but they certainly produce a really good understanding for us to follow the trends. But all in all, they show or they generate quite similar data. So once again, based on those data collected, we made comparisons, analyzed them. So the data collected from satellites and the data we collected using upward-looking sonar devices below the water surface, the correlation we concluded that it's quite, I mean, significant. and they gave us a lot of confidence in interpreting the data. Yeah, of course. Whenever you carry out research activities, there are always outliers among the data sets. So in reality, it's not just one sea ice that will be analyzed. So there are a number of sea ice we recorded. So that means we obviously have to add a process to validate the accuracy of our data. And I used to pull some strings on my personal connections that I have. The experts in Russia, and when I made a comparison, once again, it gave the similar results. So between 0.0 and 0.6. So there are some gaps, but as I mentioned before, between west and east in the Arctic region, there are some different currents flowing. That is one of the reasons why. But at the end of the day, we still validated that our research outcome, analysis outcome is quite trustworthy. And once again, to validate it for the second time, to validate our outcome, there's a book called Ice Mass Balance book. It's published by a really well-credited U.S. organization. So, as you can see, there are dotted lines and hot lines. So we made comparisons, those two different sets of data, as shown on the graph on the right. So, just except a couple of cases, they almost match. So. That means, these data certainly will help us have a better understanding of the sea ice conditions in the summer season. So this shows that the geographical distribution of daily summer sea ice, the draft. So from June 1st to 31st of August, on a daily basis, that's, the period is from last year. So we successfully collected, maybe this is for the first time ever in the world this is shown. Maybe I shouldn't have showed to you because this is what live streamed on YouTube, but I'm a little bit worried. But anyhow, I brought it for you. I think that maybe it's okay because all the details are not disclosed here. So anyhow, once again, taking this opportunity, I'd like to highlight the importance of having really accurate understanding of the sea ice conditions in this summer season in the Arctic Ocean. So as I've shown you before, with this more accurate picture of the sea ice conditions in the summer season, that will certainly serve as a really good foundation for us to further develop our operation development in the Arctic Ocean. So again, from climate, researchers' point of view, how they will change, year after year. So as shown on the slide, it changes. So yes, maybe, we missed out or didn't have the quite important data in the past, but now I can assure you that we can collect, at least from now on, more accurate data. And even we can actually calculate backward, retrospectively. So we can have a trend backwards in the past. And if you look at the spatial distribution from 2013 to 2021, for the first time ever in the world, once again, we are now able to have a method to calculate the thickness for the and interannual variability of sea ice draft on summer season. So this is based on the data collected. This is really meaningful. So as I explained to you, between this period, there are maximum and minimum values of Arctic mean ice draft. I think this will certainly go into history as a really important turning point and milestone. So going back to the beginning of the presentation. So the really thick red lines. Some again to believe that as long as we have a good understanding of the our ice thickness in the winter season, maybe we can guess or estimate at least how it works in the summer season. But no longer we need to guess or just vaguely think about what will happen in the summer season. Now we have a more accurate way to analyze them. So once again, we believe this will be really useful tool for climate, related research activities, also shipping and logistics activities, which is closely related to tapping into the Northern Sea route. So let me move on to the summary of my presentation once again, and just measuring the thickness of the Arctic sea ice in the summer season. Now we have developed a really good method, so we have no doubt that this will fully support the development of the Arctic Northern Sea route development and operation as an official data set, a credible data set. But still, yes, we also know that there is a room for improvement to enhance the accuracy of our data and measuring methods. So based on the international maybe research papers, I hope in the near future we will be back with more further follow-up research activities to help us better understand the ice conditions in the summer season. So with this, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
예, 좋은 발표
Well, Dr. Kim, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Well, it was quite interesting and fresh, perspective he shared with us. It was obviously very technology-driven presentation to understand the sea ice conditions in the summer season, how it is achieved from technology perspectives. Yes, I believe everyone agrees that it's really important for us to have a really good understanding on the sea ice conditions. That certainly will affect shipbuilding and operation and navigation of the ships in the NSR. And it was quite interesting for us, especially someone like me from the commercial area. So I'd like to thank you for that. It was quite interesting and easy to understand. We have last one presentation.
준비
It will be delivered by Director Morten Larsen, Director of Arctic Operation and Technology of DNV from Norway, and his presentation will be year-round sailing via Arctic shipping routes. And please welcome him with a big round of applause. The floor is yours.
Thank you, dear ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this 11th International Arctic Shipping Seminar. My presentation is based on more than 15 years of my experience from working with shipping in polar waters. That has been based on research and commercial projects related to identifying and mitigating the risks related to shipping in polar waters. I've also been working a lot with the IMO Polar Code implementation. I'm responsible for that in DNV, and currently DNV has issued more than 370 polar ship certificates. Next, please. Just to note that this presentation only discusses some of the technical and operational aspects that must be considered when evaluating possible operation along the Arctic shipping routes. And this presentation does not consider the current consequences of the Russian invasion in Ukraine that has on the operation along the Northern Sea route. So, as mentioned before, currently the NSR is closed for other than Russian vessels. Next, please. There are three main routes that we normally are discussing when we are looking at transpolar and these shipping routes. It's the Northern Sea route along Russia, it's the Northwest Passage, and it's the transpolar over the Polar Sea. However, the main challenges are the same for all the three routes, but there are some differences to be aware of. Next, please. The first step is to be aware of the different climate effects. Generally, when entering the polar waters, there are several climate-related issues that must be considered. So, where you plan to go, you must get an overview of these different effects and how this will impact on your plans. And of course, these effects are strongly dependent on where you plan to go and the part of the season. Next, please. The second step is to identify the route-specific hazards. There are the hazards shown here are mentioned and are the basic hazards that should be considered as a part of the assessment required to do related to the polar code. Of course, it's icing, it's low temperature, lack of crew experience, periods of darkness, high latitude, it's remote, there are limited search and rescue facilities, a lack of suitable emergency response equipment adapted for these conditions. The weather is rapidly changing, the impact on the environment, and finally, you must be aware that the risk level is depending on the geographical location and the season. Next, please. Main two parameters, and which we also have discussed here, is of course the ice, which is the main limiting factor, but also I would like to mention the effect of sea spray icing that can have significant impact on the operation of the vessel and its exposed equipment. If you operate in ice, you don't have the sea spray, but you will have it before you are entering into the ice and after you are going out of the ice belt. There will be areas where there's a high risk for sea spray ice. Next, please. The third step is to estimate the actual risk. We know a lot about risk related to shipping from worldwide experience. Then, when moving this into polar waters, we have to identify the additional risks, shown here as the small red additional factors. And when we have the complete risk factor picture in polar waters, then we must find measures to mitigate this additional unacceptable risk so that we can come down to more or less the same risk level that we have outside polar areas. Next, please. So, what are the basic issues to be considered when we are evaluating the Arctic shipping route as an alternative? The main argument for using the northern routes is that it's shorter distance, which again will result in shorter sailing time and less fuel consumed. Traditionally, the main driver has been to save money. But with the increasing environmental requirements and focus on reduced emissions, the shorter route may also result in less emissions for the transported goods compared with other routes. So if you look at the greenhouse gas efficiency, simplified by taking the weight of the transported goods and divide it with the distance, of course, when the shorter distance will have a positive effect. But we need to evaluate the additional risks and the costs involved and compare that with the shorter distance and see if this operating along one of the Arctic routes is more beneficial from an economic point of view than going outside polar areas. Next, please. However, there are several factors that will influence on the cost that must be considered. The main cost is that the vessel must be designed for the planned operation, taking the significant seasonal and annual variations into consideration. If you plan for a year-round operation, you have to design for the anticipated worst and extreme ice conditions. Ice strengthening and ice class adds steel weight and increases the building cost of a vessel. The propellers have to be stronger and will therefore be less efficient in open water. And if you design the vessel with an ice-breaking bow, of course the hydrodynamic efficiency in open water will be decreased compared to ship optimized for open water. So, and generally there is a need for much more power in ice, which you don't need outside the polar waters. And finally, you need to winterize the vessel, that is to adapt the equipment to the conditions that you plan to operate under. So generally, we can say that vessels designed for operation in heavy ice or in heavy polar conditions are only competitive in polar conditions or in ice. Next, please. Some more factors that we need to consider is that a vessel designed for seasonal operation must for every season decide when to start and end the season based on the actual condition. For example, if you have a more heavy ice during the spring or the autumn, you might require that the vessel must use an alternative route compared to the polar route due to these unforeseen ice conditions. And then you have to reroute it, which implies more waiting time and longer distances. So it can be difficult to plan for when to start and when you can have the last trip if you go for seasonal operation. There are also possible additional time to wait for icebreaker and often not the optimum vessel speed is obtained if you have to go for a convoy, which is typical for the Northern Sea route. You wait for the icebreaker and you go in a convoy. And there's always a risk for ice damages to hull and propeller. We heard that there will be less ice in the future, but there will always be ice in the polar waters during the winter, and this will break up, it will drift around, and depending on the weather and other conditions, there will always be a risk to find some ice in polar water, especially during the spring and autumn. Training requirements, only today the Polar Code requires training for the officers on watch and not for the whole crew. And vessels must comply with the IMO Polar Code and have a valid polar ship certificate. Next, please. So what about year-round sailing along the Northern Sea route and the Northwest Passage? Northwest Passage, not feasible today. It's only summer. There are no organized icebreaker assistance along the Northwest Passage. And the icebreakers are only available and very limited during the summer season to support local shipping. NSR open for vessels with the right ice classes, but you need a permit from the administration. It must be designed for the worst condition during the planned operation. Icebreaker service available, and normally all vessels must follow a convoy. There can be delays due to the limited icebreaker availability, and that must be included when you look at the logistics. And periods with extreme low temperatures must be expected. Next, please. Transpolar, direct over the pole. This route is not used today due to the prevailing ice conditions. It will require very high ice classes if you plan to do year-round operation. Ships with high ice class and ice breaking possibilities. The advantage is that this is in international waters, no limiting national requirements. There are no icebreakers available, no or very limited search and rescue resources available. But the future reduced ice in polar waters may make this route more feasible in the future, especially during the summer season, but still heavy winter conditions. Next, please. So to summarize, with the NSR closed, year-round operation is not feasible today. Summer operation along the Northwest Passage possible, but limited SAR and icebreaker resources available. Ice can be a problem even during the summer, and it can be quite unpredictable, as we saw in the last presentation. Due to the wind conditions in the polar areas, there will be ice drifting from the central polar areas towards the coast of north of Canada and Alaska, which can make this area quite difficult. Transpolar will, even during the summer season, require vessels with highest polar ice classes and icebreaker capabilities, increased cost, weight, and what I have mentioned earlier. And so the vessels designed for transpolar operation will not be competitive outside polar areas and will require reloading to regular ships. Meaning that if you have a ship designed for heavy polar operation, it should be operating in heavy polar operations. Less ice is expected in polar waters in the future, somewhat thinner during the winter, less multi-year ice, but more drifting ice and new ice conditions that we need to consider. And still, the ice information we get about the detailed ice conditions along the route are not too good, but more satellites will improve this in the future so that we can get better and higher quality on the detailed ice maps, which will reduce the risk for ice damages and getting stuck in the ice in the future. Next, please. So with this, thank you for your attention, and if you have questions, we'll take that in the discussion after the next session. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. So that was the presentation from Mr. Larson from DNV. And your So I think this is a very good a presentation to move us to the next session dealing with the commercial aspect of the Arctic Sea routes. And he explains a lot about the additional risks and how to manage and mitigate the such risks. And then he also touched upon that the risks, whether it is really feasible compared to the feasibility. But the advantage is reduced cost and lower emission, and those were compared with the other factors that are required for the vessels to be operated in the polar seas. And I believe this moves us to the next session, which will deal with the commercial aspect of the Arctic Sea route or Arctic shipping. And the ice-class vessels, when they are operated outside of the polar water, they are less competitive, so it's better to operate them in the form of transshipment. Thank you for your insightful presentation.
Once again, I'd like to thank Professor Yoon for moderating this session 2. With this, we will conclude session 2. We will take about 20-minute break, and please be back by 3:55 at Korea time, so that we will resume with the session 3, the last session. Once again, thank you very much.